Welcome to Intake. If you haven't already, why don't you hit the subscribe button and then the notification button, so each time we drop an episode, you will be notified. It's time to shine the light from a mental health perspective. Welcome back to Beneath It All in the African American Community, Episode 2, Part 2. There are great doctors out there from all cultures, but there are so many that just don't get it. And they don't get it because we live in a society that has conditioned us to believe a certain way, even about ourselves. Let me just say that we did an episode on mental health in the African American community. My co-host, Jules Jean-Pierre, she talked about epigenetics. I didn't know enough on it. And my argument was, I don't quite agree with this whole trauma gene. And that was out of my own ignorance because I didn't know enough. And I'm okay with coming back and restating that. But in doing the history and understanding now what epigenetics is, I understand that there is a history of trauma. Even watching all the other young men that have been shot down on TV, every time I watch it, it does something to me. And it does something to me that is unchangeable. It does something to my mental state, my emotional state. And so we have to talk about these issues, and we have to understand that there is a long history within the African American community, a history that needs to be addressed, if among nobody else, amongst ourselves. And we have to stop ignoring it. I understand that there are a lot of African Americans out there who are angry now. I see it on all the social media platforms. Why don't we just stop this? Racism doesn't exist. That's not true, and history says it. And I'm sorry, but you all know I'm okay with just being honest because I know how to back up with research. But we have to be honest about these issues, and we have to educate ourselves. That's what I mean. We have to educate ourselves. This is important information. Everything that Dr. Edmondson started us off on, unfortunately, while some African Americans know this information, unfortunately, a lot of them don't. And this mistrust that we have in the helping field, it just crossed over from generations. And we don't not necessarily understanding why we mistrust, maybe because parents didn't trust the doctors or grandparents. And we didn't understand why, so we just carried it on.
Well,
yes, Dr. Emerson.
Like Gina said, she was aware of some of this history. Mm-hmm. Gina, I'm sad to say that until I did this research, the only one that I knew about concretely was the Tuskegee Institute experiment. The others, I had no idea about that part of these experiments. I don't know if it was because when we do Black History, that 1 week or 1 month or whatever it is in February, these experiments are never really talked about. So I did not know. And I was so fascinated that, yes, I went in and did and still continue to go in depth just to see. And I've talked to people recently, and they don't know. They know about the Tuskegee, and it must be in a lot of books, the Tuskegee study or something, but they don't know about the other history. They know about slavery through the words, but they don't read about it. Most of them seem to don't care about it. And you, right here in Jacksonville, everybody that comes to Jacksonville from the north that I know, and they're from Detroit or Chicago, I take them to the plantation so that they can look, visualize, walk it, feel it. Because they need to see it. I tell them all the time, you didn't come here working at Ford and General Motors making all that money. You came on the backs of people, the blood,
I love it. And Dr. Edmondson, we need more people like you. Yeah, because we definitely have to educate our young people. We have to educate our older people, you know, and just help them understand what's going on, how to advocate for themselves. As mental health professionals, we know we teach our clients how to self-advocate. Mm-hmm. And advocating for yourself is important. Advocating for yourself, whether it's a mental health professional or a doctor, it is very important. And again, I brought up the last time that we spoke about the experiment. I can't remember the gentleman's name, but I'll put the reference at the bottom. When they did the experiment with showing why people don't question authority. And that was that whole buzzard where they kept pushing the button and they had this person thinking that she was shocking somebody, but they weren't hooked up to any electricity at all. But they made her believe that, and they made the individuals believe that. And some of the people, every time they said increase the shock, for some reason they pushed that button. And they pushed that button because it was a doctor. It was somebody in a white coat that represents authority was telling them this, even though consciously they knew it was wrong. And so it's important that we understand that no matter who you go in front of, and this is for all people of color, no matter who you go in front of, it's okay to advocate for yourself. It's okay to ask questions. If you don't understand, ask questions. If they can't give you the answer, then please go ask somebody else until you get the right answer. That's what this is about. Opening up our mind to learn about the history. Opening up, hopefully, those who are willing and will watch outside of communities of color and help them understand the importance of what's really going on beneath the African American community.
I think what resonates with me, facts are facts, right? The way that we understand those facts, the way that we interpret it, experience it, we explain it to someone else. But the root of it is it's still the facts. Like what has happened to us is in fact a fact. So the way I experience it and another person perceives what I've experienced can be two different things. But it takes conversation for folks to be able to begin to understand, oh, I am seeing it from my perspective. I'm not really understanding it from your perspective. And I say that to say this. For me growing up, and Dr. Edmondson mentioned, I learned about my history after I was 18 years old. It was a concerted effort in my family for me not to understand it. My mom really did believe that, she wanted a world that was not prejudiced. She wanted a world that was not racist. She didn't want me to be raised in that society. And she felt responsible. Why? Because my mom was light in complexion, and she really believed that somewhat advanced her, particularly she came from a Caribbean country, and that advanced her to some degree. When she came to America, she understood quite quickly that it didn't really matter. In fact, she did housekeeping and was called the N-word by a child. And because my mom was so unaccustomed to that, she backslapped the little girl, because that's, in terms of maintaining yourself in order. And so that I can put that in context, corporal punishment, this whole issue of corporal punishment among people of color, it's really about making sure that your child did not lose their lives. You wanted your child to be able to conduct themselves accordingly, and you did not want someone who's not of color, to harm your child. So yes, we were pretty aggressive in making sure our children stayed on, the right lane. So my mom, married someone of dark complexion. So I'm melanated. I'm deeply melanated. So my mom really tried to shelter me. So when I went to college, I went to predominantly white college, I was shell shocked. It was complete shell shock. And I decided to take certain courses. And this is when I went in. I didn't initially go into mental health because my mom didn't respect that either. That was just not what the family understood. And I went into computers. I went into engineering. That didn't work out. And it's not because I couldn't grasp the coursework. It's because I wasn't interested in the coursework. So when I went into mental health, I started to look into Black psychology. I started to look into different things that were really focused on people of color and begin learning the history of who we are. And the facts are what helped me to begin understanding why, what was going on with the perception of people and the experiences that they were having. See, I learned how to deal with anger. I learned how to deal with pain. I learned how to engage people who were white from my mother, because she impressed upon me, this is the way you conduct yourself. And it stayed with me. It wasn't until I was an adult that I began to have an opinion that was other than my mother's and began to say, but Mom, this is not okay when people treat you like this. So when you go to the doctor, and they are telling you what to do, and you could tell by the opinions they're making. I mean, it would sit with me, and I wouldn't say anything for many years. I didn't say anything. I didn't challenge my physician. And my physicians weren't people of color until I was probably, much older. All my physicians, because my mom really trusted white physicians more. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until I was older that I began to say, something's not consistent with what you're saying. And this is the first experience I began to have about what it meant to act outside of what you're expected to. And it's not comfortable. So many people of color face this uncomfortability, not just not having the knowledge, not understanding how to advocate, but not really feeling comfortable advocating. I've had to, and I work with doctors. I taught doctors these concepts. And many times I had to help doctors to understand they're not angry. Why do you believe that in the vocabulary of people of color, why is the only term anger? Why isn't it indignation? Why isn't it fear? Why isn't it alarm? Why isn't it, they're asserting themselves? Why is it just anger? Why are you doing this sweeping generalization that it's anger? But if the person was sitting in front of you were white, you would be able to have your vocabulary in terms of placing it upon the person would be vast, but not when it comes to African American, because you're conditioned. And just to mention, you mentioned that today, even today, in the medical books, it still speaks to African Americans having tougher skin, having, stronger jaw bones when it comes to dentistry, when it comes to, being able to just tolerate pain. It still exists in the textbooks. So can you imagine what they're up against and what people of color who really don't have resources, who don't understand, who can't articulate, are sitting in front of a physician and being able to say, this is what's going on with me. I'm not quite sure how to articulate. I have a pain. There's been so many fights on the ground to help providers understand. No, people can have a substance use issue and still have legitimate pain, and it needs to be treated because it's not okay for people to stay in pain.
Thank you, Gina. Thank you for that. Indeed. I think it's important that we identify how African Americans are seen in Western society. And you're right, it is. It's conditioning. And I personally don't know how do we uncondition these beliefs that run, far in Western society regarding African Americans. I think the problem is that media in itself shows throughout history, even when they did the movies back in the day, they always showed African Americans as angry and animalistic. And so there has been this picture painted that we're just a group of angry people and violent people, which is not true. And media plays a great part of that when all you see is a black man every time you turn the news with, stapled as a violent criminal or a thug, as they say. I know for myself that I often look at the FBI website. Anybody can go there and look at the numbers and see the numbers based off violent criminals in these different cultures, race as it is, and you'll see the numbers differ. But why don't we hear it in other cultures? It's because of the picture that Western society has long painted this idea of African Americans as being an angry, ignorant group of people. I just had the conversation with other professionals and even my daughter. And they were saying to me that regardless of how many degrees that they have, they're still only seen as black. And it becomes easier to call me Miss than to put a doctor in front of my name, and I worked for the degree. And that's what I hear from them. Now I'm at the master's level, but still at the master's level, I still feel some heat. And that's what we have to talk about, because there is some conditioning. But not only that, there's conditioning amongst our community where we've turned against each other. And there's a mistrust with us regarding each other. And so when we look at it, it all comes back to conditioning. Thus is why we have to look at history and see what is going on in the history, why these things exist.
The conditioning, it'll always be there. Even with the movement currently going on, the Black Lives Matter movement, the condition was there before time. It's traveled throughout history. I have colleagues that are doctorate. They work for it. Oftentimes when we're in a meeting, professional setting, you can correct several times professionally. It still goes back to, oh yeah, Evelyn, it's not Dr. Halls or Dr. Morrison. So they've been conditioned, and we've been conditioned to accept it. We've been silent for a very long time. Oftentimes, we've not given ourselves the credit that we deserve. You put a lot of time into a master's program. You put time into a doctoral program. We all here are of high education. We put a lot of time into graduate work. Even though you walk into corporate America, you do not get the credit. You're always finding yourself working a little extra hard. Well, you have a doctorate, sure, prove yourself. What do you know? And it's history. We can go back to the history again. All that stuff has to be discussed, and it has to end. If I come to the table, you have a doctorate, I'm trusting what you're telling me about mental health or my own mental health is of value, is important. And sometimes as African American, as people of color, this country has not given us credit for the hard work we've put into our education. And it's part of our history. We're conditioned to sometimes come to the table and not address those issues and not quickly redirect. Same thing with medical. The doctor says something, we're just conditioned to just kind of nod and leave and not ask questions, not go for a second opinion. And oftentimes, I personally have had that experience of feeling uncomfortable, knowing in my gut feeling, okay, this doesn't sound right, but I'm just being pushed along because they've got another appointment, or I'm not as important. Let's just get her out of here. Oh yes, it's this, and move on to the next person. So the condition is something that's going to take a very long time. But in order for that to begin to disappear, we have to immediately begin to address these issues and corrective action.
Yeah. And can
I agree
that we have
I agree.
Individuals out there across cultures who are willing to have conversations. Do we have enough? Is the question.
enough people having a conversation?
Yes, enough people having the conversation who are willing to have the conversation.
I don't believe that. I'm sure there are a number of people. I don't know how to define a lot, if there's enough, and meaning I think the issue is, what conversations are we actually having, really, and the response to questions are, what do we really, similarly to a doctor, or even all of us as mental health clinicians, what are we treating? What exactly are we targeting? What are we treating, out there? Because there's so many different conversations, there's so many opinions, there's so many particularly sweeping generalizations. We have to be mindful to be mindful and cognizant to target the issue that we really need to hone in on, like we're doing today. Yes, history, because there is a narrative out there that what has happened before doesn't apply today, is wrong. It does apply today. It lives with us today. It shapes the way that we think, we feel, and we see the world. We're engaged like that. So whether you want to believe that there is or is not racism is really up to you. You can choose to see it, and you can choose not to see it. But it doesn't mean it doesn't exist by definition. Right? And you could pull yourself up by bootstraps. And yes, and some of us do and able to do, we struggle through very difficult times. But do not tell me that the system still isn't geared to hold many of us down, and that us getting through was by the skin of our teeth. It wasn't expected, and that's what creates division between us as well. Because of course within African Americans and Blacks, there's this haves and have not, because the perception is you had to have something different than I did. You could not have grown up the way that I did. It really is, what's the narrative in the home? What's been the experience? What did they see on TV? What did they hear? There's a lot of dynamics that reinforce the person's inability to see past the narrative that they're being told in reality. And I'll share this one thing. I remember as a young kid, and growing up in a home where you were dark in complexion, everyone else was light in complexion. I became conditioned to not really, and then the narrative outside, not really to appreciate the tone of my skin. And I remember closing my eyes one day, and I was probably like 12, and praying to see the beauty in dark skin. And I just kept praying that prayer. And it was over a couple of weeks to months that I woke up one day and I saw it. And that is when I began to understand that the conditioning was here. That's when I began to understand it. I said, you have to be careful. And I didn't think I would become a mental health clinician at that time. But I began to understand that is what I've been told is why I believe and then act in accordance with what people are saying I am, not who I really am. And finding out who I was a journey, and it's still a journey to this day. And many African Americans and Blacks are really on that course. So yes, there's a lot going on today in the world, between the pandemic, between the George Floyds. Yes, George Floyd was the tip of the iceberg, the needle in the haystack. That was it. People had just had it after that. Okay. No, and people hone in on his background, but I don't care what you say. This is what I mean by the facts. What is the issue with George Floyd? Is it that he was this horrible person, or is it that he was executed in front of people on camera? So why are you getting lost in all these issues? The issue is it okay for a police officer 2 and 3 to execute a person in that manner? Is that what we're talking about? Because that's the issue for me. And that's the issue for many people. But because we hear all this other stuff, the chatter, sometimes we can lose sight. And this is the fight we have as mental health clinicians, to hold each other, together so that we can stay on course. But imagine having to hold other people who gets, tossed back and forth by all these different narratives and opinions and perceptions. It's really important that people of color understand that their opinion counts, and it will be shaped by additional information. It will be shaped by having conversation. The one thing that I want us to know is that we must talk. That is how we will grow. That is how we will get the information. That is how we will be interested in researching it more. But we have to be in this conversation and not get distracted by the other conversations that do not change your trajectory in the future or that of your children's.
I agree.
Yeah.
I thought of something as you were talking, Gina, because it's very important. And I smiled as you was talking. I smiled because conditioning is so very strong. While you were battling with being darker skin, I, on the other hand, were battling with being lighter skin. Because as a little girl, I had African-American people, family members, and other people coming to me, pinching my cheek and going, oh, we were in the slave days, you'll be a house slave. And I was treated differently because I was light-skinned. And so when you said you were praying, I prayed, Lord, just let me go out in the sun and get darker and maybe they'll like me better. It's real.
It is.
And we still have it today among our community, colorism. We still have it. We still have the issue. And so that's what I mean about having a conversation. Just start it. It doesn't matter where you start, just start. I mean, I have Caucasian friends who I talk to and we just start. I'll never forget when I was in my studying for my bachelor's in psychology. I had this great professor who had been in this experiment in high school where her teacher had a group of them go live at each other's house. African-American children went and lived at Caucasian people's house and vice versa. And they were able to see how each other lived. And so what she did in the class is she partnered us up. And she partnered us up with someone who didn't look like us. And I was partnered up with a Caucasian female. And she said, and just be honest, talk to each other about the stigmas, the things that you heard about each other's race. But the idea, we were able to have an open conversation, neither she or I was offended. Because what we were doing, we was touching on the conditioned biases that we had. And we just had a conversation. So what I mean by that is, it doesn't matter where you start. Just be willing to start the conversation without being on the offensive. Because truth be told, we all have biases. We've all been trained with biases. And until we touch on them as people, we will always deal with these issues. And I know everybody is not willing to touch on them. But as many who can and who's willing to, why not?
No, you're right. I agree with you. I really, and I like what Miss Gina said, just to start a conversation, but stick to the issue of the conversation. Mm-hmm. I mean, pick an issue, discuss it, pick an issue, advocate for it, share your feelings about it. And you know what, this would, again, I still believe this would be a great time if we had and your platform here, Intake, is a good place to just start, just like we're doing, and talking and getting that information out to people, just communicating it. Because that's how people are going to learn, changing that mindset.
Yes, I totally agree. Ladies, before we end the show, anybody have any last words? Okay, so I'm going to close it on this. I want you all to remember this term, projection. Those of you all who have studied psychology, we asked the question, why does so many people view us as angry people? The term projection in psychology is a primitive term for a defense mechanism. And that is, and it occurs among individuals and groups. What happens is a person disowns an unacceptable idea or impulse by projecting it onto somebody else. Now, what we see is when we talk about white supremacy, and understand when I use the term white supremacy, I don't mean all European Americans. I mean white supremacists who are racist and only see Black people as minute. So what we see with white supremacists is we see anger, we see hatred, we see violence. Carl Rogers, as we all know, he had the term used as the shadow. The shadow was an aspect of culture. The shadow refers to those parts of the collective psyche that are split off from consciousness because they are too painful to fully acknowledge. And so we have to understand what white supremacy is about. It's about projection. It's about the shadow. And it deals with the unacceptable ideas and characteristics of the individual or group, be it conscious or unconscious. So I disown these negative traits and ideas by projecting them onto people who don't look like me or bring out the insecurities within me. And that's psychology. So that's what I'm going to leave you all with, viewers. Until I see you again, remember to continue to talk about mental health and how to make yours a priority. Have a great
Join us next week as we look at the ideas around eugenics and the African American community.
If you're a professional who would like to be on the show, or an individual who has struggled with mental health and would like to be a guest, email us at info@intake.tv.
Follow us on all of our social media platforms.
If you'd like to learn more about Intake or our guests, visit our website at intake.tv. Join the conversation by making a comment below.